I am a sick man. I am a wicked man. With this sentence, Fyodor Dostoevsky began one of the most revolutionary novels ever written, a work that marks the frontier not only between 19th and 20th century fiction, but between 2 centuries' visions of the self. For the unnamed narrator of the Notes from Underground is a multiplicity of voices, each at war with the others, all at war with everything else. And that's all well and good, but have you ever been a teenage girl? The early 2010s saw the beginnings of a great shift in the internet's landscape. Netflix was the dominant streaming service and only had one price. The idea of commercial-free binge watching was pretty revolutionary and groundbreaking at the time. And I guess it would be today too. Publishers were pushing out dystopian YA novels at lightning speed in order to capitalize on the popularity of the Hunger Games. Marvel movies were just starting to pick up speed and notoriety. Stomp, clap, folk music was infiltrating the pop scene. TikTok was simply an onomatopoeia, and Corona was just a beer. And I was in high school. Yes, during this digital boom of social media, vloggers, and top text, bottom text memes, I was navigating the swirling labyrinth of hormones that inverted, subverted, and upside down and backwards verted my ego into somehow thinking I was the most powerful and intelligent being alive while also drowning in self-loathing. I was maddened by the dissonant chorus of clashing thoughts colonizing my mind that could only be quieted by the soft, gentle page turn of a John Green novel, catching my briny tears. Who could possibly begin to understand the knotted, tangled ball of yarn that was my adolescent consciousness at the time? Well, apparently, Dostoevsky. Fyodor Dostoevsky was born in Moscow, Russia in 1821 to parents Dr. Mikhail Andreevich Dostoevsky and Maria Fyodorovna Dostoevskaya. His father was a physician to the lower classes, allowing him to observe the way that ailments and illnesses were perceived when accompanied by a lower income. By 19, he was orphaned, and by 25, he had published his first novel, Poor Folks, which gained him access to literary circles and a higher tax bracket. In 1850, by age 29, Dostoevsky was incarcerated in Siberia. He was arrested for his involvement in the Petrashevsky Circle, a progressive literary discussion group. He spent 4 years in Siberia as a political prisoner, and upon his release, he published some of the most famous novels that we know him for today. Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, The Brothers Karamazov are some of Dostoevsky's most notable post-incarceration titles. They tackle themes of morality, isolation, exile, and punishment. In 1864, a decade after his release, Dostoevsky published Notes from Underground, an experimental, existential examination of ego and obsession. Told in 2 parts, Underground and apropos of the wet snow, Dostoevsky's unnamed narrator, who I'll be referring to as the Underground Man, confesses to a life of invisibility that results in self-isolation. The first part reads as the confessional ramblings of a madman. He's preaching to an invisible audience, contradicting himself, and waxing poetic about the state of the world. All the while, the Underground Man takes every opportunity he can to remind readers, the gentleman to whom he's always referring, of his superior intelligence and lowly position in his social circle. He's just like me, for real. He says in section 2 of part 1, I swear to you, gentlemen, that to be overly conscious is a sickness. I'll bet you think I'm writing all this out of swagger, to be witty at the expense of active figures, and swagger of a bad tone besides, rattling my saber like my officer. But gentlemen, who can take pride in his sickness and swagger about them besides? I want to quickly clarify that although the title of the book is Notes from Underground, and that I'm referring to the character as the Underground Man, and part 1 is called Underground, he's not, literally underground. He's not narrating from the grave or anything. That's another video. He's living in his apartment in Petersburg, a man of 40 who's had time to reflect on the world around him, although you'll find that in part 2, which takes place 16 years in the past, he's always had these thoughts. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My camera died, so this is my 4th time trying to record this section of the video, so the light is changing, the light in my eyes is dying, and we're just gonna make it through. Anyway, part 1 is wordy. The Underground Man takes these concepts and ideas and runs in all these different directions with them and makes it difficult for readers to catch up with his thought process. In fact, he even interjects and tells the reader like where we're meant to be positioned in his narrative, just to help us along. But part 1 serves an immense purpose in establishing the underground man's character, how he thinks about himself and how he thinks about the world around him. About himself, he relents, "Oh, if I were doing nothing only out of laziness, Lord, how I'd respect myself then. Respect myself precisely because I'd be at least capable of having laziness in me. There would be in me at least one positive quality, as it were, which I could myself be sure of. Question, who is he? Answer, a lazybones. Now, it would be most agreeable to hear that about myself. It means that I'm positively defined." When analyzing the human condition, however, he is a lot more straightforward. He says, "They say that Cleopatra, excuse this example from Roman history, liked to stick golden pins into her slave girls' breasts and took pleasure in their screaming and writhing. You'll say that this was, relatively speaking, in barbarous times, that now, too, the times are barbarous, because again, relatively speaking, now, too, pins get stuck in, that now, too, though man has learned to see more clearly on occasion than in barbarous times, he is still far from having grown accustomed to acting as reason and science dictate. But even so, you are perfectly confident that he will not fail to grow accustomed once 1 or 2 old bad habits have passed, and once common sense and science have thoroughly re-educated and given a normal direction to human nature." Russian theorist and philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin has a theory about chronotopes or chronotypes, which is essentially the merging of time and space. This is something that Dostoevsky is utilizing in this scene, wherein he merges ancient Egypt, so you have a time of antiquity and a place that is, countries away, continents away, merging with modern day Petersburg, or their modern day. So us reading it in our modern day is another layer of time that we're adding to it. It's very interesting stuff. So he layers the anecdote about Cleopatra in ancient Egypt above his current Petersburg. He claims that man still finds ways to stick pins in one another, despite the fact that science and rationality should have taken over our human form or our human condition by now, that science should have dictated that we don't cause harm to one another anymore, but we still do. We're still in barbarous times. Explicit temporal layering in the underground man's historic example parallels how he perceives his community from his position in the social underground. So we wrap up part 1 with a thorough examination into the underground man's current state of mind before we go back in time 16 years. It's important to note that while we are going back in time, we are still getting the narration of the current underground. We're not really placed into that temporal space. Every instance, especially dialogue, is filtered through that 16 years of experience and bitterness and jadedness. So definitely take whatever he says with a grain of salt. By no means is he utilizing this framework to further endear himself to the reader. He is still just as brutally harsh on himself and others at 24 as he is at 40. Part 2, apropos of the wet snow, begins, "At that time I was only 24 years old. My life then was already gloomy, disorderly, and solitary to the point of savagery. I did not associate with anyone, even avoided speaking, and shrank more and more into my corner. At work in the office, I even tried not to look at anyone, and I noticed very well that my colleagues not only considered me an odd man, but as I also kept fancying, seemed to look at me with a certain loathing." Like, that is almost verbatim my diary in 10th grade. I hate everyone and everyone hates me, but you've probably never even spoken to them. So clearly there's not been a huge change from part 1 to part 2. He's still anticipating people's arguments, he's anticipating people's perception of him, and even throwing some of that hatred back. So he lays the groundwork for his environment. He has an office that he works in as a titular counselor, which is a government position that is not necessarily the top, not necessarily at the bottom, just kind of in between, kind of average, below the radar. Like invisible. The motif that follows him throughout the second half of the novel. After work one night, he walks by a bar and someone is being thrown out through the window, actually. And immediately he thinks of how nice it must be to be perceived to the extent that someone could hate you enough to throw you out of a building. So he goes in and tries to start a fight so that he too can get thrown out of the building. Of course, nobody really takes notice. Nobody seems to care that he's in there. And it drives him nuts. There's a police officer approaching him. He thinks maybe this is my time, this is the opportunity, someone is going to see me. But the officer simply puts his hand on his shoulder and pushes him out of the way and walks on by as if he wasn't even there. Cue obsession. His mind is consumed with finding out who this man is. He finds out where he lives. He finds out his name. He finds out who he works for specifically. He finds out that he frequents Nevsky Prospect, an area of Petersburg, and he goes to catch up with him whenever he can. In this little story, he slips in another preachy moment about people stepping out of the way of certain people and not wanting to inconvenience certain people. He says, "Why precisely you and not him? There's no law that says so. It's not written anywhere. Well, he can yield by half and you by half, and so you will pass mutually, respecting each other." He takes this philosophy and runs with it as he does. He decides the ultimate revenge on this man is to stand in his way and not move. I dreamed of it ceaselessly, terribly, and deliberately went more often to Nevsky to picture more clearly how I was going to do it. I was in ecstasy. The intention seemed more and more probable and possible to me. Not really to shove him, of course, I thought, growing kinder in advance from joy, but just so, simply not to give way, to bump into him, not so very painfully, but so, shoulder against shoulder, only as much as decency warrants. Exactly as much as he bumps me, I will also bump him. You tell him, King. In the end, the police officer revenge scheme doesn't go anywhere. He freezes up and steps out of the way, and as far as the police officer knows, he's just some other guy in the street. I think this is a great way for Dostoevsky to position the underground man socially. So he's below, supposedly, police officers in that sense. So he is a lot more intimidated by them than he would be somebody who is positioned below him. And he does have people positioned below him. He has a servant in his home, and as a man, he's got misogyny on his side. The next part of Apropos of the Wet Snow is a little bit unexpected. The underground man goes out to dinner with acquaintances. He's kind of miserable the whole time, but afterwards he follows them to, how do I say this? An establishment where you can pay for a woman's companionship. I'm not too sure what I'm allowed or not allowed to say, and I want this video to stay up, so we're just gonna keep it friendly. Here he meets Liza, a young woman of the night, and we are to assume that he's utilizing her services, but the scene just cuts to them lying on their backs on a mattress on the floor, staring up at the ceiling. Oh, and it's pitch black. The setting is important. They're not looking at each other, they're looking at the ceiling, and it's dark. So if they were looking at each other anyway, they wouldn't be able to see each other. This absolves the underground man of having to face the consequences of what he's about to do next, which is berate this woman into next week. My God. He spends the next 6 pages absolutely tearing her to shreds. What are you gonna do when people don't want you anymore and you can't, support your family making a living in this way? And she tries to kind of come back at him kindly, of course, but he just keeps pushing and pushing and pushing until eventually she breaks. Her breast was bursting. Her whole young body was shuddering as in convulsions. Suppressed sobs were straining, tearing her breast, and would suddenly burst out in wails and cries. She'd cling to her pillow even more. She did not want anyone there, not a living soul, to learn of her torment and tears. But luckily for the underground man, he's not really a living soul. He's just a fly, right? So eventually she breaks down enough that he actually starts to feel bad. So to reconcile, he gives her his address and tells her to come over. I mean, hey, it's better than nothing. He goes home, he passes out, he has a long, restful sleep until he wakes up in a panic because, oh my God, I just berated the hell out of some woman last night and then told her to come over. Now, this wouldn't be too big of a deal, except he is pretty ashamed of his living conditions. I was constantly tormented by the thought that Liza would come. Abject poverty in this apartment, and I dared to go to dinner yesterday in such clothes. And this oilcloth sofa of mine, with the stuffing hanging out of it, and this dressing gown that doesn't even cover me. Such tatters, and she'll see all of this. Dostoevsky's using 2 very distinct images here. Stuffing coming out of a chair, and clothing that isn't covering all of the underground man's body, or at least not covering what it should. These are 2 images that evoke vulnerability, inside coming outside, something that is not being covered that should be covered. In a way, the underground man is just as embarrassed by the state of his home and the state of his clothing as he is by the state of himself. His insides are outsides. He's afraid of the emotional or the mental or the psychological disembowelment that comes alongside and parallels the state of his home. So Eliza does come over and accepts this as an apology for the way that he was treating her the night before. Someone out there for everyone, I guess. She doesn't mind the state of his home. She doesn't mind the couch. She doesn't mind the tatters. She's so kind to him, and it drives him nuts. He can't stand his self-loathing not being reflected back to him. He can't stand the fact that he could possibly be wrong about the people around him and about the world and about this crystal palace that he's been so judgmental of. So he lashes out. He says, I cannot be good. But I don't think he wants to. By saying he's not good, he doesn't have to try and fail to be good. It's a tale as old as time. I know what you're thinking. This guy needs therapy. And yes, I'm inclined to agree with you. He's spiteful, he's arrogant, and he's lacking in accountability. He lets those around him get hurt because he can't reconcile with his own emotions. This is very standard therapy, self-care language that we've all become accustomed to in recent years. But I think we're doing ourselves a disservice if we were to write off the underground man in this way. Rather, I look to the underground man as a twisted reflection. The self-loathing that Dostoevsky portrays here is a brilliant examination of contradictory confessions. He spends the whole first half of the novel in this confessional state, but it's the moments where he reflects this obsession with himself and others that reveals his true character. How I hated her and how drawn I was to her at that moment. One feeling intensified the other. Well, there you have it, folks. It's not the part of him that wants love and companionship clashing with the part of him that is dissatisfied with the state of the social culture around him. It's both. It's one and the same. It's yin and yang, and they support and feed into each other in a way that keeps him in a constant cycle of self-loathing. This dissonance results in a messy monologue that is projected from a place of isolation into a void. Literally me, as the kids say. There's so much more I could say about this book, about the layering of monologic and dialogic elements, the references to Dostoevsky's contemporaries like Gogol, the Crystal Palace, which is a reference all in itself. But I wanted to bring something a little bit more accessible, with a bit more brevity to the surface. There's been a lot of conversations lately about how we're talking about books on the internet, what kind of books are being talked about, how we're changing the landscape of the publishing industry, and the paradigm shift that we're kind of having in the moment. So I kind of wanted to throw my hat in the ring and talk about something that was interesting to me. So let me know your thoughts. Have you read Notes from Underground? Are you familiar with Dostoevsky? Have you read any of his other works? Are you a bigger fan of his pre-incarceration novels or his post-incarceration novels? I've been lucky to read a lot of him so far this year, and some of his contemporaries as well. So there'll be a little bit more coming. So that's all from me. Go read a book, stream Joe, and the little people in your phone are not your friends. Bye!